Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapters 11 and 12 in our continuing study of the Old Testament prophets. Back in chapter 9 and verse 8, we had seen judgment against Israel presented in four refrains. And then in chapter 10, verses 5 through 19, we had the scene shifted from Israel to a judgment against Assyria. You see, Assyria had been the one bringing those judgments. I mean, God used Assyria as a tool, but now the tool itself was judged, and then there was a promise of a remnant in Israel. Now we come to chapter 11, and it's going to open, and we will see in this chapter, actually the next two chapters, the reign of the righteous branch. Back at the end of chapter 10, notice how it ended. Behold, the Lord, the God of hosts, will lop off the boughs with a terrible crash. Notice that reference to boughs. It's sort of a tree theme there. Those also who are tall in stature will be cut down, and those who are lofty, so tall and lofty, that's picturing trees, but it's people as trees. Those who are lofty will be abased. He will cut down the thickets of the forest with an iron axe. And Lebanon, of course, Lebanon was known for the great trees, the cedars of Lebanon. Lebanon will fall by the mighty one. And of course, what you get, the idea is that he's not speaking of literal trees and literal forests, but these are representative of the high and mighty in the world that have been in rebellion against God. Now we come to chapter 11, verse 1, and we still have that tree theme. Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse. Now, when it speaks about a shoot, you could call that a twig, a sprout. A sprout's going to come up from the stem of Jesse, and it's a picture of this great tree that's been chopped down, and yet from that chopping, from the stump that is there, up will come a tiny sprout. Up will come a tiny stem. Notice a stem of Jesse and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. So it's a stem that not only brings forth growth, but then it grows up big enough to bear fruit of its own. And of course, when you refer to Jesse, Jesse was the father of David. So this is the house of David that had been, or was going to be, it hadn't happened yet in Isaiah's day, but it was going to be cut down. But then after the cutting, from that stump would come forth a new sprout, a new one who would again bring hope and fulfillment and growth to the kingdom. Verse 2, the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. And then that Spirit goes on to be described further, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. 7 different ways that the Spirit is being described here. You could almost describe it as 7 spirits. We're actually going to see that elsewhere in the scriptures that will make reference to the 7 spirits of God, not 7 independent. It's not like God is disunified like that, but rather it's that 7-fold characteristic, that perfect characteristic of the Spirit of the Lord. Notice verse 3, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. And he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. That is his judgment, because he's delighting in the fear of the Lord. His judgment is not superficial. It sees down into true judgment. It goes past the surface to look at what is real. The verse continues, but with righteous judgment he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth by the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Now that sounds very much like what we read in Revelation, chapter 19 and verse 15, where you have this picture of Christ coming. And notice it says, from his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. Notice the rod of his mouth, the rod of iron, and this coming forth from his lips and from his mouth. Now this is not a supreme case of halitosis, of bad breath, where he speaks. You're not supposed to take it literally. It's what he says. Remember that this is a picture of God who spoke the worlds into existence. In all throughout Genesis chapter 1, we read, and God said, let there be, and then it was. And then he says, let this happen, and then it does. And let that happen, and it does. It's God's creative work. But notice here, his creative work turns to judgment, where he speaks and judgment takes place. And notice how it began with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And it reminds us of Jesus, who would speak out. Of course, the prophets do this too, but Jesus also would speak out about justice and fairness, and his words brought comfort to the poor. And Jesus was never impressed with the rich and the high and the mighty, the religious leaders. He wasn't about that. Instead, he was about the meek and the lowly. Verse 5, also righteousness will be the belt about his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. Now these references to clothing, notice our metaphor is shifted. It reminds us of Ephesians chapter 6, where we read about the armor of God and how we are to take on the armor of God, the loins girded with truth, breast plate of righteousness, feet shod with the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit. And when we read that, at first glance, perhaps we imagine that Paul, as he's writing one of these prison epistles, maybe he's sitting in a Roman dungeon and he looks over and he sees the guard and he uses that as the imagery. I used to think that was the case, but no. Paul is actually taking it from the Old Testament, and especially from here in the book of Isaiah. Now, this is just one example. We're going to see others in the book of Isaiah where we'll see the armor of the Lord, and what that means is the Lord is wearing the armor, and we're allowed to wear that armor as well. In fact, we're called to do that because what worked for the Lord, what worked for, and remember, when it talks about him, that's speaking of God. And yet notice how Jesus encompasses that description, because he is the one who came. He is the stem, the sprout from the stump of Jesse that came forth and spoke truth. Verse 6, and the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little boy will lead them. Also the cow and the bear will graze, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like an ox. And that's not the way it is today. And it hasn't been that way since the fall, back in Genesis chapter 3. You put the wolf and the lamb together, and the wolf is going to eat the lamb. You put the lion and the cow and the bear, they're not going to all eat together, and one's going to eat the other, because we live in a world today that's dog eat dog. We live in a world today that is suffering the effects of the fall. And yet it is envisioned here as a return. Can I say a return to Eden? It's pictured this as a doing away with the strife and the killing and the death. He goes on in verse 8, same theme, the nursing child will play by the hole of the Cobra. There's actually a family story that's told among my uncles back when they were still alive. They're all with the Lord now. But of how some snakes had sort of come up into the yard, and one of my uncles, it was just a little tiny toddler. He wanted to go touch these sort of things, and these snakes would have killed him. They were poisonous snakes. And the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den, and the idea, it will be okay. Because verse 9, they will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. Now, holy mountain that's the idea that God is reigning, it's his place. But it's not just confined to the holy mountain. Notice, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Now, in the Jewish mindset, when you went down to the ocean, you looked at the waters, they went all the way to the horizon, as far as you could see and beyond. And that's the picture of how the knowledge of the Lord will fill the entire world. Verse 10, then in that day, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse. Remember, we started that off about the stem coming up from Jesse. The nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. So you have this picture of the nations gathering. And of course, in one sense, that at least began to be fulfilled when you had Acts chapter 2, where the nations symbolized by all the different language groups that were there in Acts chapter 2, and they had gathered together, and then God's Spirit showed up because the one who was the root of Jesse had come and had died and had been buried and risen from the dead. And so we see in verses 1 through 10 the coming of the branch, but now we see the return of the remnant. That's what's being introduced now, that because the branch has come, now the remnant return. And so in verse 11, then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people. Notice the first time you actually had a scattering that's going to take place. It had actually begun to take place already in Isaiah's day as the northern kingdom is carried away into captivity, but eventually we see it also with the southern kingdom and the captivity where it takes them away to Babylon. And they did come back. But now notice there's a bigger and a better recovering. That is a recovering in faith. Notice how it's described, the remnant of his people who will remain from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and from the islands of the sea, from every direction. This picture is of people coming back to the Lord. Verse 12, and he will lift up a standard for the nations. Notice, this isn't just Jewish people. This is for the nations, and assemble the banished ones of Israel. So it includes the Jewish people. And will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And so God's people are being gathered back in. Verse 13, then the jealousy of Ephraim will depart. This is a family issue. You have to understand that Ephraim had been looked at as one of the leaders of the tribes. And whenever anybody did anything without Ephraim being involved, Ephraim got a little bit upset. They got downright jealous, and you can read about that in the book of Judges. But the jealousy of Ephraim will depart from that thing for which they were both known for. And those who harass Judah will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, and Judah will not harass Ephraim. And the kingdoms that were broken apart, the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, they're going to be reunified into one people. Verse 14, they will swoop down on the slopes of the Philistines on the west. Together they will plunder the sons of the east. They'll possess Edom and Moab, and the sons of Ammon will be subject to them. And Israel is being described as coming again and being predominant. Now, this happened in part in the days after the Babylonian captivity, and you see elements of this, for example, in the days of the Hasmoneans, the folks that we know as the Maccabees, where they did indeed possess Edom and Moab and Ammon, and these other peoples became subject to them. Verse 15, and the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and he will wave his hand over the river with his scorching wind. So notice Egypt on the one hand and Mesopotamia on the other, and he will strike it into 7 streams and make men walk over dry shod. Verse 16, and there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people who will be left. That's the northern kingdom that had been taken away into captivity to Israel. And notice there's a coming back, just as there was for Israel in the day that they came up from out of the land of Egypt. So you have the coming branch, and now we've seen the return of the remnant, but finally we see in chapter 12, and it's not very long, only 6 verses, the Song of Thanksgiving. And so chapter 12, verse 1, then you will say on that day, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, for although you were angry with me, your anger is turned away, and you comfort me. Behold, God is my salvation. That's the theme here. At least in these first 2 verses, this theme of salvation. God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid, for the Lord God is my strength and song. And he has become, there it is again, my salvation. And it's a song of thanksgiving and a song praising God as the one who has not only saved us, but who is our salvation. If we're connected to him, then we're connected to the salvation that he brings. Verse 3, therefore you will joyfully draw water from the springs, and there it is again, the springs of salvation. A third time that salvation is mentioned. But now we come to verse 4, and in that day you will say, give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, make known his deeds among the peoples, make them remember that his name is exalted. And notice the name. First we saw the salvation, but now we see his name being referenced, not once, but call on his name and remember that his name is exalted. Who is the name? What is the name that means salvation? The Lord's salvation. Yeshua. That's how you say it. It's a prophecy of Jesus. And we come to verses 5 and 6, closing the song. Praise the Lord in song, for he has done excellent things. Let this be known throughout the earth. Cry aloud and shout for joy, O inhabitant of Zion, for great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel. In your midst? That was always the point of God coming to be with his people. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be in your midst. And of course, you had the tabernacle where God showed up and was in the tabernacle. Where was the tabernacle? It was right in the midst of all of the tribes. Or later on, you had the temple being built, and God shows up and he enters the temple with a glory cloud coming in, and God is in their midst. And as Jesus comes, we read, and the Word became flesh and dwelled with us, in our midst, among us. And he even says, he talks about that time when he's not going to be physically with us, but he says, where two or three are gathered together, and of course that's in the context of judgment, of the church passing judgment and bringing righteousness and justice. Jesus says, where two or three are gathered, there I am in your midst. There comes a time when the people asked, where's the kingdom? And Jesus said, don't go looking for it over here or over there, for I tell you the kingdom is in your midst. It's right here. If only you have eyes to see. It is here in your midst.